What kind of questions does this open up now that they're embracing decentralization so much as well?
Yeah, well, first, thanks for having me. I think really 2 points on the Coinbase announcement. The first is I do think it reflects what's really going on in the crypto space right now, which is enormous progress and development at what you'd call the infrastructure level, where those developers are working at. And then more broadly, when you ask about the policy question, I think there's a really interesting, what I'd call, tale of two companies. Right? You had an FTX, a company that was based offshore. In my view, really more of a centralized financial entity that committed, at least based on what we've seen and been reported, all kinds of fraud, but the type of fraud that you've historically seen in centralized finance over human history. And then you have a company like Coinbase. Brian Armstrong, who you referenced earlier, made a really interesting decision 7, 8, 9 years ago to base his company here in the United States to push the frontiers of innovation to create more economic freedom, more economic opportunity, but to do it within an existing legal system, and particularly a set of laws that were actually created before computers even existed. So I think Coinbase is actually a really interesting example of how you can actually push innovation in this space while operating within a paradigm that is still very much old school.
Chris, of course, the company you work at now is one of the hottest venture launches in the crypto space recently. When you're thinking about centralization versus decentralization within the parameters of the existing laws that exist around the crypto community, what are you more comfortable when it comes to putting money to work with?
Well, first of all, we raised $1.5 billion almost a year ago to the date. And for us, we're really focused on investments that will play out over multiple years. This goes back to something I was just touching on. We see enormous opportunity in what I would call the infrastructure area, where you're getting technology that deals with scaling, deals with interoperability. Basically, in layman's terms or layperson's terms, the type of technology that you're ultimately going to need for this to be consumer-facing and for everyday consumers to be able to use. Now, to the specific question about the decentralization versus the centralization, I mean, look, by definition, within crypto, it is a decentralized space. That's ultimately how you democratize aspects of capitalism, particularly online. Within that, there can be a spectrum of issues and ideas. What we spend a lot of time with our portfolio companies, and even the potential projects that we may or ultimately may not invest in, is what's the quality of the team? What's the quality of the technology? Do they understand that there's going to be a complex regulatory map out there? They don't necessarily have to have all the answers from day one, but they have to reflect an understanding that they're going to need to navigate this and navigate it in a responsible way. So that's amongst the things that we think about when we pursue our investments. I have to tell you, we're incredibly excited about the types of founders we're seeing, particularly in those early stages where they're really beginning to think about, okay, here's where the world is, here's some of the regulatory stuff we need to navigate. But we have incredibly powerful ideas about how we can scale and make this technology really consumer-facing.
Okay, Chris, you're so powerful with Haun Ventures because of the expertise you can lend the portfolio companies, some of them that we're just seeing there. Your passion around Web3, I've had firsthand from you. But I mean, you before were helping advise companies such as Airbnb as they were scaling. You're someone who knows Washington, the way it works so intimately from your background. What do you make of the way in which the SEC is, by some turns of phrase, our guests have said, look, basically regulating by enforcement rather than setting rules of the road?
Yeah, I've called it an enforcement-only approach. I mean, if you take a step back, a year ago, almost to the date, I may be off a week or two, the Biden White House put out an executive order. It was sort of a high watermark up to this point in time in Web3 crypto regulations because it really expressed a desire and interest to foster and facilitate responsible innovation. You fast forward to where we are today, and there really has not been any coherent strategy coming at the federal level in terms of actually how do you support and advance that type of a holistic approach. And what you've basically defaulted to is policy through enforcement. It's a little bit like if we had just invented cars and there were roads out there, and you basically had to figure out the speed limit based on who was arresting you at what speed and then how the courts ultimately would interpret that. That's no way to create a coherent policy. And I'm old enough to have gone back to the 90s. I was working in the Clinton administration. We passed the 1996 Telco Act, worked with a divided Congress, Democrats and Republicans. That put the U.S. on the path to being the digital center of the world. That translated into enormous economic power, enormous national security power. At one point in time, I think the 5 largest companies by market cap in the world were somewhere between San Francisco and Seattle, right? And then you look at what's going on today. And but the history of the U.S. has always been a country, since its founding, that embraces innovation with government, public and private sector working together. Interestingly, with this enforcement-only approach, it is actually ceding its leadership role. I mean, as we speak, in your native UK, we have activity right now to potentially pass legislation by the end of this year, which could be amongst the most farthest reaching in terms of defining a regulatory framework for crypto to make the UK a crypto hub.
Chris, will companies leave?
I think that, look, I literally just had a meeting a couple days ago. These weren't Haun venture companies. These were some others. And they had reached out to actually really try to understand where could we potentially be looking at the world. And each and every one of them was looking at places like the UK, even looking at Europe. And, you know, as someone, again, who came up in the US, the idea that Europe is actually ahead of the US and thinking about regulatory frameworks is just something that I had never really seen before. And so I do think you're going to get to a place where companies, projects, protocols, initiatives, founders, entrepreneurs are going to begin to look around the world about where they want to base themselves. Some may do the U.S. and something else. Some may only do something else. Some may spread their developers into these different places. But ultimately, this technology is happening, right? This is the next wave of the internet. You see it with other private sector entities wanting to engage with this technology. You see other governments. And the question for the U.S. is, do we want to maintain our historic leadership role, or are we going to give up on that?